evening, everyone. I'm Peter Slavinsky. I'm the president of the Meriden Historical Society, and I want to introduce to you Brian Cofrancesco, and he's going to do the Jedediah Wilcox and his mansion.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm really excited to see such a good turnout here. How many of you remember the Jedediah Wilcox Mansion? Oh, wonderful. Were any of you involved with the campaign to save it back in the 60s or 70s? No? Okay, just thought I'd ask. Well, as you can see with the number of people here and how many of you remember it, this is clearly still part of our history. That's part of why I've spent the last 4 or 5 years trying to study this house and study the history, the mystery, and the legacy of not only the house, but of the man who built it, Jedediah Wilcox. And so that's what I'll be talking about tonight. I'll be standing from the middle of the room, so hopefully you can hear me project myself. But I wanted to start off with a quote, as all cheesy people do when they give a talk. It's from a book called The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova. And she says, "I like a puzzle, as you know. So does every scholar worth his salt. It's the reward of the business to look history in the eye and say, I know who you are, you can't fool me." And that's what, for me, the past 4 or 5 years has been, is you've got this famous figure who's, as you'll learn, a very, very important person in Meriden history who's fallen off the scene and his house is demolished. So somebody who's really fallen to the wayside and trying to bring that history back and help people share their memories and share their recollections and really bring forth this really important story. So my interest in the mansion actually started probably 10 or 15 years ago. And some of you may remember this photograph if you're familiar with the history of this house. And this actually appears on the City of Meriden's website. They do a historic photograph tour. And as a 7th grader, seeing a house like this and thinking, this is in Meriden, it kind of took me by surprise. So many of you may know the name Richard McBride, who was the city historian for many years. I worked my way in middle school through City Hall, through all the contacts to find out who this Richard McBride was, and emailed him and asked him about this house. And he told me the name Jedediah Wilcox, and it had been demolished, and that was pretty much all he said. And so years later, when I went to college studying architectural history, I decided I wanted to write a paper about this house. And of course, as you can imagine, there's not much that exists on it still. And I'll talk about the process that went into the research and kind of what I found. But that's really spiraled into something bigger. And so I've been doing a lot of research. Meriden Historical Society, State Library, and even the Bradley Home is a really big repository for the things I've been looking at, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. So we're going to start with the history of this. And for those of you who do live in Meriden, you can shout things out. Will you hear the name Wilcox? Who or what do you think of? School. Silver. Silver. The street, Wilcox Avenue. The Highland Country Club, there you go. So especially those first 3, anybody know which Wilcox that's associated with? Horace. He's a nice guy, but you know, he's not my favorite. He's really the best known of the Wilcoxes. He was one of 12 siblings, and he's the one who gets a lot of the fame. Everything we just said, the school is named after him. He's known for silver. He was the president of the Meriden Britannia Company, which used to stand right down the street where the hub is now. He was also a mayor, a senator, really well-known guy. But he kind of drowns out this other gentleman, Jedediah Wilcox, which is who we'll be talking about tonight. Now, although he's not a really well-known figure and was often overshadowed by Horace and their other famous brother, Dennis, who was one of Horace's business partners, I want to read you a snippet from an article in 1887. This is about 13 years after Jedediah Wilcox leaves Meriden. And the Meriden Daily Journal writes, "Within the past 10 or 15 years, but few corporations have been formed that have not been rewarded with success, or at least sufficient support to warrant a continued business. The heyday of these quickly formed and spasmodic concerns was when Jed Wilcox was the moving force in Meriden's business life. The failure of the woolen mill, the chief venture in which he was concerned, put a sudden stop to the formation of these mushroom firms and relegated the prime mover, Jedediah Wilcox, to comparative obscurity. No man that has ever claimed Meriden as his residence could boom a thing like Jed Wilcox. He was a hustler from way back, and if he had not succumbed to the too many irons in the fire disease, this town would be much further advanced than it is today. Because Mr. Wilcox, with all his faults, took a deep interest in Meriden and in doing things for its advancement. So keep in mind, that's only 13 years after he's gone from Meriden, and people are already saying he's been relegated to obscurity, but he did quite a bit for this town. That's my favorite part. No man has done more for Meriden than Jed Wilcox. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll agree. So if we go way back, Jedediah Wilcox was born March 4th, 1827. So he celebrated his 187th birthday last Tuesday. Looking pretty good for his age. He was born in the Westfield section of Middletown. If you are familiar with Meriden, you go out B Street, you head out past the Suzio Quarries, and you'll head down into the Westfield section of Middletown, take a left onto Atkins, and the house is down there. Recently went on the market. And that's the house on the right, and on the left are his parents. Not the most attractive of people, but his father, Elisha, was a farmer. He was also a congregational deacon, so well established in the Middletown community. And then his mother was Hepzibah, who's on the lower left. And what I find interesting is there's a book called A Century of Silver, and it talks about when Dennis, Horace, and Jedediah were little kids. Horace and Dennis had these big aspirations. They wanted to be silver peddlers, which back then wasn't a glorious job. And while they wanted to be peddlers, it was Jedediah who was off saying he wanted to own his own companies and his own businesses. So a lot more goal-oriented and really thinking big beyond his little role here in Westfield. And so by the early 1850s, he moves to Meriden. He's on the scene here by 1848, at which time he is only 21 years old and living in this house on the left and on the right. These are two photographs of it. I don't own a house like that, and I'm older than 21, so it's kind of impressive that at such a young age, and in the 1840s, 1850s, he's already accumulated such wealth. On the left is from a map of Meriden. So some of you may be familiar with maps of the period. They're giant. In the center, they've got the large map of the streets, but along the edges, they have a select few buildings that are important in the town that they've featured. And so on the 1851 map, they found that he was wealthy enough and important enough to include his house on the map. Again, at this point, he's only 24 years old. And on the right is a later photo of it. It was known as the O'Brien House, and it also came down in the 1970s. Some of you may be familiar with that. That was his first house, also on Broad Street. And so if you take a look, this is the map that comes from the center of that larger map. And you can see right here, J. Wilcox, that's the house, and right above it is the Colt and Wilcox Carpet Bag Factory. So this is at the corner of Camp and Broad Street, and that was the first company he started here. He was in the carpet bag business, which were suitcases made out of recycled or leftover carpet, which became much more popular in the 1860s during Reconstruction after the Civil War. But he got into this business very early on, and in 1848, the year he comes to Meriden, he also marries his first wife, which is important to keep in the back of your head. Her name was Clarissa. She was from Mansfield, Connecticut. Not quite sure how they met. But he was 21, and she was 26. So he's going for the older ladies. 5 years older, and I want you to keep that in mind, because that becomes important later. His business prospered quite a bit. And after several partnerships and mergers and other business ventures, he formed the company J. Wilcox and Company, which many people know him for. And that was, including the carpet bags, he added ladies' hoop skirts to his business and ladies' belts. And within a few years, his business was a $300,000 a year business, which doesn't sound like too much today, but that would equal $8.1 million. So again, 1850s, he's in his 20s, and he's got an $8.1 million a year business here in Meriden. Pretty impressive. So he picks up speed, and he's picking up attention, and within a few years, he's actually appointed to the board of the home insurance company in New Haven. So his importance and his influence is spreading far beyond Meriden. And in that same year, he has his first son, Irving Wilcox, who tragically dies at the age of 4 from scarlet fever. So early on, he's met with tragedy in his life and a great deal of sadness. This is his gravestone in the Wilcox Cemetery in Berlin, Connecticut, and it's right next to his mother's grave right beside. So we fast forward into the 1860s. He's married. He's lost his first son. And with my research, I found that the year 1865 is a very pivotal year for him. And keep in mind, in the national context, this is the year the Civil War ends, the year Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. So there's a lot going on in the country. That same year, in January, he's increasing his civic engagement, and he was appointed to the board of the First National Bank of West Meriden, which some of you may know if you study Meriden history. And he remained a director for 10 years, which was pretty incredible at that point. But as you'll see, his position and his status in the community, people wanted to keep him on board. In February of that year, he was considered the wealthiest, or second wealthiest man in Meriden. $10,000 a year was what he was making. And that was just based on his tax returns. In another year, he had slipped to number 5, but you may recognize some of these names. Charles Parker, $30,000 a year. His brother Horace was at 25.8. His other brother Dennis at 21. I.C. Lewis at 15, and Jedediah Wilcox at 10. So building up his steam and his power, and this is only 1865. Later in that month, in March, it was said that his company was valued at $175,000. The company's value itself, which equals $5 million today. So this year is kind of characterized by ups and downs. I kind of think of it as a sine curve. So you think he's considered one of the most famous men. He's getting appointed to many boards around the area. And then in June, his factory burns. His Balmoral skirt factory caught fire, attracts national attention. This is the reconstruction of it later on when it became the woolen mill. It was rebuilt later in that year, but on the top right, it says New Haven, Connecticut, Wednesday, May 31st, 1865. The large Balmoral skirt factory of Mr. Jedediah Wilcox and Company in Meriden was entirely destroyed by fire this evening. Loss, $300,000, insurance, $250,000. And that's being reported in New York. This also reached Newport. It was reaching out west. The fire was so big and so impressive, I guess you could say, that it's reaching national audiences. His luck starts to pick up a little bit. In July of that year, he was appointed the Grand Marshal of the July 4th Independence Day Parade. Again, keeping in mind the Civil War is now ended, you've got all this national pride, so to be the person who's in charge of the festivities was pretty important. And I found a great article from the Hartford Courant that said, Hartford was considerably depopulated on Tuesday, and of all those who went out of town to celebrate, the greater share proceeded to Meriden. So it gives you an idea of Meriden's status at the time. The 4th of July, Independence Day, people are flocking from the capital city to come to Meriden. So again, he's up and down this year, all these different problems, and then he's the Grand Master of the parade, and then his wife files for divorce. I hear a lot of sighs, but you might not want to sigh just yet. She filed for divorce in August of that year, and I was reading over the divorce papers, and she cites the reason for this divorce, quote, respondent has at diverse times during said period committed adultery with diverse lewd persons in the petition are unknown. So he was having 1, 2, 3, who knows how many affairs on the side. And Clarissa had it. So it's pretty impressive, too, if you think about women's rights of the 1800s, that you've got a woman who's filing divorce against her, what today would be multimillionaire husband, Jedediah Wilcox. So she hires a lawyer by the name of Orville Platt, some of you may know, who's another high school in Meriden named after. And she won $33,000 from that settlement. And even the newspaper, because there were huge articles in the newspaper about this divorce, says that that's quite a bit of money. It says that his income every year, again, was $10,000. So to give 33 to your ex-wife is pretty impressive. But the divorce papers say he's worth anywhere from $200,000 to $500,000. And so he gives her what would today be $450,000 in alimony. Pretty impressive amount for the time. One source states, and it's one of the only sources I can find, was that he did remarry by the end of 1865. So between September, mid-September when the divorce is finalized, he has October, November, December, he's got another wife. Does anybody remember how old I said his wife was in comparison to him? 5 years older. He goes from Clarissa being 5 years older to Henrietta Blindeming, who's 15 years younger. It goes the exact opposite way. But again, he's in his 40s at this time. I'm guessing he's probably thinking about the future. He needs a family. He doesn't have any children yet. So he marries Henrietta, who was from Newington at the time. And I haven't been able to prove it yet, but in having discussions with some of my historical society friends last year, Leslie actually brought up, well, maybe it was one of the workers from the factory, Henrietta Blindeming. So I haven't been able to figure that out yet, but that's a possibility. And that wouldn't have been too uncommon for manufacturers or people who owned big businesses run and staffed by women at the time. So in December of that year, he partnered with his brother Horace, Charles Parker, a name you'll hear in a little bit, Aaron Collins, and a man named Hezekiah Miller to form the Wilcox Britannia Company. And he remained president of that company, and keep in mind, he's already got his hoop skirts, he's got his carpet bags, he decides to move into silver, or Britannia rather. He's only president of that company for 2 years. And that's when it turns into, as many of you may know, Wilcox Silver Plate Company, which became very well known, later absorbed by International Silver, but they continued the use of the name Wilcox Silver Plate. If you have time afterwards, I have in a little box over on the table a spoon that, as best as we can figure out, dates to that 2-year window when Jedediah was president of the Wilcox Britannia Company. And so in the past 4 or 5 years, I haven't seen any Wilcox Britannia things come on the market, but that one, it does date to 1865 to 1867. So the factory that you can see here was on Pratt Street originally, and I'll show you the location of that in a little bit. And so again, his business is building, his factories are becoming more and more successful. In 1866, he actually acquired a patent. He held 4 patents in his lifetime, and I've got copies of them over there if you have any interest in reading them over. Most of them have to do with hoop skirt clasps and metal formations within the skirts. But he bought one from a man named Elliott Savage, and he paid Elliott Savage $500,000, turns around and sells it for $2 million. So a savvy businessman at the time, and that was for hardening iron. So he was really thinking about how to make his business as best as he could make it. And this is an article. This also reached pretty impressive national attention. The Scientific American publishes this article saying that he purchases the patent and then turns around and resells it. Right around this time, the newspaper makes a great quote about him, about Jedediah. He rode about in a flashy carriage drawn by a span of high-stepping horses, driven by coachmen, and attended by footmen, both in uniform. So I want you to think about, I want you to have that vision of him in your mind, riding around on a carriage, and when we talk about his house and his factories in a few minutes, I think you'll find it fairly amusing. Later that year, he has his first daughter, which we'll talk about her later, Lillian, born in 1867. And in that same year of 1867, Meriden changes from a town form of government to a city. And when you change to a city, that means you elect a mayor. So we had a runoff between 2 of the biggest industrialists in Meriden at the time. On the left, Charles Parker, and on the right, Jedediah Wilcox. So show of hands, how many of you think Charles Parker won the race for the first mayor? How many of you think Jedediah Wilcox? No guesses, anybody? Well, to all the Wilcox supporters, I really appreciate it. But Charles Parker beat him in a really devastating, for me at least, that he didn't win that race. But he was appointed as an alderman, so he was a local official at the time. And he ran again in another election in 1869, also didn't win. So very tragic time, but he remained involved with the government, which was really important. And especially when they were changing to a city form of government, they're setting local boundaries, and he was involved with all of those commissions and those city committees to help Meriden become a city. So we'll talk quickly about his house. I showed you this image a little earlier. I want you to keep that in your head. The left is the house he was living in by the 1850s, and on the right is a map of, again, where the J. Wilcox house was. A fairly large house, again, considering he was in his 20s when he built it. But by the year 1868, when he had so much wealth, he was on his second marriage, and he had a daughter, he decided it was time for something a little bit bigger, so he builds this, which is what many of you know him for, the Wilcox Mansion up on Broad Street. The mansion was designed by Augustus Truesdell, who was an architect out of Rockville, Connecticut. And he didn't do too much else, mainly things up in the Rockville area, and not much is known about him. But I did find, going through some records, that his son lived on South Colony Street in Meriden, down near the Record Journal. So perhaps some conversation. His son was a joiner, so maybe he recommended, oh, my father's an architect, and got him involved with this project. The local builder, so at that time you'd have an architect who designed, but somebody who's overseeing the construction of the house, George Gay. And he's best known for a couple monumental buildings in Meriden. He had built the Wilcox Woolen Mill, which you saw a few slides ago. He built the Meriden Britannia Company factory, which is the one that stood down at the hub. And he's known for a lot of churches and homes, in particular the Lewis Mansion, formerly the Samazic Funeral Home, up here next to City Hall, all built by George Gay. And if you can picture the Samazic home in your head, which we'll see in a little bit, very similar in style to the Wilcox Mansion. So this is a sighting image of the house itself, and this is really important. So right here on the left is what we call fire insurance maps, the Sanborn maps from 1901. And on the right is a 2010 aerial view of the house. And so if you've been to the site before, you know the Beaches Medical Office Complex sits here. And here you can see where the house was. So approximately there, in the little green box, is where his first home was. So he moved right next door. And there may have been some shady deals in how he acquired the land, because he slowly purchased it up, and you see the guy who was living on his site moves farther down the street than across the street. So we don't know how he acquired it, but you can see the move was not very far. And what I find most amusing is if you keep in mind that idea of Jedediah Wilcox riding around in a carriage with horsemen and coaches, he was going from his house here on Broad to his factory right there on Pratt Street. Again, giving you an idea of the wealth that he was able to acquire in such a short amount of time. The yellow, 290 Pratt Street, many of you know that as New Departure. And across the street, no longer stands, that's where the Wilcox Britannia Company was originally. And the yellow one later became the Woolen Mill. So as you can tell, the house really dominated the landscape, and there was a very impressive article that was published in 1870. It was called Matters About Home, and I have a reprint of it from the 60s or the 70s out if you'd like to take a look at it. And it was published in the Meriden Daily Republican only 2 weeks after the Wilcoxes move in. It only took 2 years to build this house. If you think about building this today, I don't even know if you could get that done in 2 years. The opening paragraph of this article about the house said, "The new residence of Jedediah Wilcox Esquire on Broad Street is a princely mansion built of Milwaukee pressed brick with Portland stone, casings, caps, sills and trimmings, water tables, underpinnings, steps, buttresses, etc., at a cost of $125,000. The building is of the," and I want you to remember this, "Franco-Italian villa style." So remember that, Franco-Italian villa, rich in design and finish. Mr. Wilcox, who's one of our most prominent manufacturers, has spared no expense in making it a model residence. So the community was fairly impressed with this house. And at the construction of $125,000, which today is about $2.2 million, they had to furnish it, of course. So they only wanted the best. It all had to be custom made at a cost of $75,000, which today is $1.35 million. So I can't think extravagantly, but if I could, I don't think I could spend $1.35 to furnish a house, although pretty massive house to fill. And at the time of demolition, which was in 1970, a lot of the original furnishings were still in the house. And at the time, they accounted, and this is just a few things, more than 33 oil paintings, 6 sculptures, 6 marble mantles, and countless chairs, cornices, vases, mirrors, and lots of other furniture throughout the whole house. And some images of the interior of the house just before demolition. These are circa 1968. And a lot of the furniture you see here was original to the house. And so typical Victorian, where you've got stuff everywhere packed into these rooms. The newel post, or the beginning of the staircase, which many people remember from this house. And so I know the word massive is so overused today, but that's the only word I can really think of to describe this house. And it had 35 rooms, over 3 floors and a basement. So part of my research has been trying to really get an idea of the scale and the size of this house. So unfortunately, I haven't been able to find any floor plans or drawings. If anybody knows, please let me know. It'd solve a lot of problems. But we'll be using, again, the Sanborn fire insurance maps from 1901. And I've chosen 3 houses that many of you who live in Meriden may be familiar with. On the far left, the Painted Lady on Curtis Street, the George Fay house. Built in 1865, so only 5 years before the Wilcox Mansion, 5,358 square feet. In the middle, the Wilbur Parker Mansion on Parker Avenue, built in 1860, so about 10 years before, 5,750 square feet. And then to the far right, the Isaac Lewis Mansion, or the Samazic Funeral Home and the mosque as it is today, up on East Main, 8,000 square feet. So those are some of the most well-known ones. And so this is a scale comparison of the houses that you just saw. And the far right is the Jedediah Wilcox house. And so on their own, you can tell just in size, it looks a little bit bigger. But when you look at square footage, 5,358, 57, 8,000, and then 4,083 feet, which, it doesn't sound that big. But that's only based on 10 rooms that we have dimensions for. So there's another 22 rooms that are still unaccounted for. And this is an incredible, from 1875. Here's the first house, and here's the second house. So I'm going to give you a crash course in American architectural history of the 19th century. And again, my training is in architectural history, so this is one of the very high-tech maps and tools that we use in architectural history. And this was developed by one of my professors, Richard Guy Wilson, and wonderfully colored in by his daughter back in the 70s. And this Wilson visual curve is intended to give you an idea of the course of American architecture across the 1800s. And so if you look to the far left, 1800, it's a little bit lower. Buildings are a lot easier to read. They're boxy, they're very symmetrical. You know where the front door is. You can tell what the house is functioning as very easily. And as you move towards the middle to the late 1800s, as that curve goes up, buildings start to change. Walls start to push out and pull in. You get different types of roof lines. You have windows coming out of places you could have windows. And they become a lot more difficult. And it's these buildings where you don't know where the front door is. You're overwhelmed by what you see. And then as you move back towards 1900, things start to calm down a little bit, but not quite as they were around 1800. So if you are familiar with Curtis Street, we're going to use that as a bit of a timeline to kind of see this in practice. To the bottom left, 1795, the Benjamin Curtis house, which is on the corner of Curtis and Markham Street. And as you can see, it's very boxy, it's plain, it's symmetrical, the chimney's in the middle, very harmonious kind of design. The mansion we saw a little earlier, the Painted Lady, comes in at 1865. And you go by that house, you don't know where you go in. You can see there's what we call mansard roofs. So roofs are no longer pitched to protect an attic. They've become steeper so that you can occupy the attic as a livable space. Lots of colors. There are towers that are coming in, porches. And then coming around to 1895, the house that's at the corner of Ann and Curtis, you can see things have started to come back together again. So you've kind of got buildings very much a single object to blowing up to starting to come back down. So where does this fall into place? Right in the middle, you got it. So if you're looking at this house from an architectural perspective, you can see you've got a tower, the walls are moving, there are porches. It's a lot more difficult to read, if you will, as a building, and falls right at the peak, not only in architectural style, but also in date. It fits perfectly with this, where this graph kind of comes to its climax on it. So this style is what we call the French Second Empire, popular in France during the rule of Napoleon II. And you may recognize this kind of as the Addams Family style house, the show that really made this type of house very familiar and well known at the time. And some of the characteristic elements of a French Second Empire house, you've got what we just talked about, the mansard roofs. So you no longer have steep pitched roofs to let water run off. It's more of a bulbous, it's starting to approach a vertical type of roof. You've got dormer windows, which come out of that roof area because you can now have livable space. Fencing here along the roof line, large towers that come in. A door that tends to be recessed, so pushed back underneath the tower or somewhere hidden in the house. You may be familiar with bay windows. This is where bay windows really start to come in across the first floor. And then porches start to appear in different parts of the house. And so if you take a look at the Wilcox Mansion, you can see easily you've got the large tower here, dormer windows, the mansard bulbous roofs, porches, bay windows. The door, believe it or not, is tucked in right back there. And we even got a bonus, a second tower that pops up in the back, just to make it even more impressive. And so this brings us to the mystery part of this. You know, you've got this beautiful house that comes on the scene, but why is it here? Where does the design come from? And of all places, why is it coming to Meriden? And that's where my interests came in with all of this. And so, again, because I like to teach people about architecture, we're going to step all the way back. If you go back to even 1607, the year that we settled in Jamestown, we've been building in America. Everyone's building their own different styles, and we didn't really have what we call architects today, because especially in the beginning, people are coming here and just trying to survive. They're bringing their traditions from their home countries. They're using whatever tools and whatever techniques are available here. And so architects didn't really come around until late 1700s, even 1800s. We had what were called master builders, or people, again, who were just using their craftsmanship skills to put up a house for survival. And it wasn't until the 1700s where the idea of style and your taste in architecture really became important. And at that time, we had what were called pattern books that came into play. Have any of you heard of pattern books, architectural pattern books? They gave you designs of what your house could look like. So it also allowed somebody who may be just a craftsman or a builder to take a design and make it their own. And so one example, if you're familiar with Drayton Hall down in Charleston, South Carolina, on the left, 1738, so only about 100, 125 years after we first came to America, we're building things like this. And the design for it comes out of a book called The Four Books of Architecture by Andrea Palladio from 1570. So you're stepping back in time, but people who just have basic training as builders are using these books of style. How can we show our wealth? How can we show our influence? And if you compare these two, you'll see they're both very boxy in design. You've got the pitched roofs up here. You've got this series of 2 windows, 3 windows, 2 windows, which we've also got here. And then this architectural element called a portico, which is a covered porch supported by columns. This is arguably the first double portico in America. And so when you compare it with Palladio, you can see where people are getting some of their ideas. Newport, Rhode Island, this is just another example out of Palladio's 4 Books of Architecture. The Redwood Library. So people who are impressed by this in a local community, well, the architect's actually copying the design from somebody else. This idea of what we call a pediment and a larger triangular pediment in the back. We've got the same design here. So people are starting to think more about what it means to have a house, what a design is. And my all-time favorite, if any of you know me, I went to the University of Virginia, and I'm all about Thomas Jefferson and his architecture. When he designed the rotunda, which served as the library of the university, he looked to the Pantheon in Rome. And if you take a look down here, we've got, again, by Andrea Palladio, a drawing of the Pantheon, split right down the middle with Thomas Jefferson's drawing for the rotunda. And you can see exactly every line matches up perfectly. So it's all about looking to the past to really create an American architecture. And even as architects are starting to come on the scene, even into the 1860s, 70s, 80s, they're still coming out with pattern books. These are two examples, Holly's picturesque county seats and Bicknell's Victorian buildings. So even as the profession of architect became popular, people are still looking to the past. And so in doing my research, I started to look to these books because I wanted to find out where might Augustus Truesdell, the architect, have found a design for this? Why might he have chosen this? And so I found this book, Samuel Sloane's Victorian Buildings. And in the cover, he calls it a call for an essentially American architecture. People are trying to come up with something that's truly American, because up until now, we've been copying the English, we've been copying the French. What is American? And so I started going through the book and flipping through, and this was like the 8th or 9th Victorian book I had been looking through, and I kind of lost hope at this point. But I stumbled upon this drawing. This is number 10 in his book. It was actually built in Philadelphia on the Schuylkill River for a man named Eastwick at a cost of $30,000. So if you compare that with 125, you know, this one was a walk in the park. And I almost went past it, but as you can see on the bottom left, it's called Design 10, a Norman Villa. Does anybody remember what I said they described the Wilcox Mansion as? Franco-Italian villa. So I'm thinking Franco, Norman, maybe there's a possibility here. So I put the two mansions side by side, and at first they may not look like they're very similar, but if you'll bear with me at it as I go through, you'll see they've both got that massive tower. The walls, you know, are pushing and pulling. There's no really boxy shape to it. The door's tucked underneath. We've got porches and bay windows everywhere. And it resembles it. It's not identical, but it has a very similar appearance to it. So I took a look at the floor plan, which was on the next page. And I kind of looked at it and I was like, okay, that's nothing too special. But up here in the corner, we have an octagon shape. Anybody remember that octagon tower from that picture we saw? I had never seen an octagon tower before in any of these books. So I started digging a little bit closer, and I decided to explore a little bit more. So again, no architectural drawings of the Wilcox. So I pulled the image off of the Sanborn maps and put them side by side. And I kind of needed a clean surface, so I slowly started to clean it up, took out all the room names. And then I decided to flip the design from the pattern book. So on the right is the Norman Villa, and on the left is all we have of the footprint of the Wilcox Mansion. And so I started looking at it, and right here, that's what's represented by the tower. And right here we've got a tower with an entryway and a door. This is where the entryway and the door were. You've got these porches on the right-hand side of the house, and even this, you can see how the wall projects here. You've got a porch on this side with a projection, which leads up to that mysterious octagonal tower up in the back. The back wall even protrudes a little. It's not in the same place, but you can see there's a protrusion there and then a bigger one. You've got bay windows scattered throughout. And then even here in the front, you've got a porch, which lines up exactly with the porch from the pattern book. So I decided to take out the rooms, and I superimposed the two images together. And as you can imagine, of course, I'm doing this by myself at 11:30 at night in some room up in the School of Architecture, and I'm getting so excited and nobody's there. And you know, you can see, it's incredible how these floor plans match not perfectly, but fairly perfectly. So I took a look at that, and I was somewhat convinced, but I said I should read a little bit further. I added the rooms back in, and the room plans you can even see match very well with the way the house is laid out. So the pattern books that came out around this time, they not only had designs for what the house could look like in floor plans, they also included suggestions for details of the house. So I started looking at some of the smaller details. On the left, this is what Samuel Sloane recommended for window design. And if you take a look at one of the windows from the Wilcox Mansion, you can see this double round-topped window with an arch that goes over the whole thing and another circular window in the middle. And if you come over here to this detail here, you've got two round-topped windows with an overarch and another round window inside. So again, I'm getting excited, but I'm like, calm down, don't get ahead of yourself. So I move on, and even if you take a look, this is a suggestion for a double window. And while it doesn't match 100%, you've got that same idea up in the dormers of the house, where you've got the double windows, and can you see how deeply that's recessed right there, all that molding? And right there, you've got quite a bit of molding setting that back. Even the bays, when you take a look, the idea of a bay window here with this round-topped window. And oftentimes, they would give you different suggestions in the book. You can do this design, you can do that design. And so Samuel Sloan said you can have a very plain one with this decorative element here, or you can put columns along the bottom. So you can see how that's kind of a split screen. And what did they do? They chose the column option. And they even had a little porch, what they call a balustrade, along the top. And there you've got a balustrade up there. And although there aren't any clear photographs of the front door, this is as best as I could get of the Wilcox Mansion on the left. You can see there's this round top, what we call a tympanum, above a door. And the recommendations for the door here are this massive round top surmounting a front door. And even if you look to the interior, which I found really compelling, on the left is a photograph of the chandelier from the house. And you can tell it's got this large circle, if you can see it there, that goes all the way around it. And here is a reconstruction of part of the ceiling from the Met in New York City. And so you've got the large circle there. And on this one in particular, it's interesting because you've got this long panel. You've got a circle in the middle, what you call a medallion, and then two other little panels that flank it. And when you take a look at the pattern book calls for a large circle going around the middle of the room, and then a panel with a medallion, and these other side panels on the angles. And so what was really interesting was that Truesdell not only used these architectural elements, but when you look inside, if you continue in the book, it says that you should use white moldings and white woodwork. And on the inside, he used white moldings and woodwork. And even the types of wood that we have reported on the inside of the house are exactly what the pattern book recommended that he use, the black walnut. So what I find especially compelling is that from that article I keep mentioning, Matters About Home from 1870, printed only 2 weeks after the Wilcoxes move in, they give a list of room dimensions, which is how I calculated some of the square footage. And so what I did was I compared the Wilcox Mansion dimensions that we have with the dimensions that are recommended in the pattern book to see how they might compare. Some of the really interesting ones are right here, the hall, 14.5 feet by 39 feet. What was built in Meriden? 14 feet by 38. 19 by 32, 19.5 by 33. 17 by 24, 17 by 22. So they're copying this book exactly, and they're trying to bring, again, this idea of taste and this idea of style here into the city. And so if you use this idea of comparing rooms, as you can see, these are the only 10 rooms that we have from the Wilcox Mansion. And if you cross over to fill in the blanks, that means that using the square footage that the Norman Villa recommends, we're at 7,433 square feet, plus 12 more rooms that we still don't know about. So you got to figure this house is at least 8,000 or 9,000 square feet. And I was pretty convinced, and I think hopefully you are too, that this is the source for this house, coming out of a pattern book, what is considered a fairly standardized book, but bringing this idea of style here into Connecticut. So, and again, if you look side by side, maybe now you can see the similarities a little bit better. The Norman Villa versus the Wilcox Mansion. Have any of you heard of the Lockwood Matthews house down in Norwalk? It's a museum. Beautiful house. I've never been there, unfortunately. But I was taking a look at it online one day, and I was trying to look for a floor plan because I'm thinking in my mind that I'd like to see this house of what it looks like from a plan perspective. In the basics you've just learned about architecture, do these look at all alike? Not really. On the left, it looks, if you're familiar with the word Gothic, I mean, it's that dark. There's steep roofs, but not much. And on the right, it's more of this massive tower that comes out of nowhere. And while it is Gothic, it's not as ornamented as the one on the left is. But if you look at the floor plans to this house, and you again take out the rooms, you will see on the left the Lockwood Matthews house down in Norwalk, using a very similar plan to that of the Norman Villa, and thus the Wilcox Mansion, with that tower or entranceway over here. You've got windows, porches, and that secret octagonal tower in the back, which is what at first keyed me off to this. And then more protrusions here on the side. And so while they don't look alike, they're using the exact same design. And I want you to keep that in mind. That's going to come up in just a minute. The house is called the Lockwood Matthews House, but it was built by a man named LeGrand Lockwood. And it was actually about 10 years before the Wilcox Mansion was built. So this brings us to the legacy of the house. And this is what I've enjoyed focusing on, is thinking about the house from its construction in 1870 up through the present, and how people remember it, as well as the history kind of combined. So in 1870, that article, The Matters About Home, concluded with, "It may be said without a doubt that Mr. Wilcox has the finest residence, except perhaps that built by LeGrand Lockwood in Norwalk, in the state. May he long live to enjoy it." So the one house that's in comparison to his is actually based on the same design. It's kind of a nice pat on the back. But despite the well wishes of the Meriden Daily Republican, his enjoyment didn't last very long. Soon after settling into the mansion, his company goes bankrupt. And based on city directories, it seems that he started something called the Waters Patent Heater Company in 1872. And then later that year, he started the Meriden Fire Insurance Company. And it appears that after starting the Meriden Fire Insurance Company, one of his insured properties in Boston goes up in flames, and he goes bankrupt, having to pay out on that. And so in February of 1874, his company, the J. Wilcox & Co., what he's worked at this point 20 years to build up, has to be sold. And to make it worse, he has to sell it to his brother, Horace Wilcox, who at that time is the wealthiest man in Meriden. And then by August, this article appears in the newspaper. And this is from the New York Times, so this is getting some pretty serious press. An elegant mansion and other desirable property for sale at public auction, the 9th day of September, the splendid residence and grounds lately owned by J. Wilcox, Esquire. And a great little description about the house and really what's going up for auction. It did go fast. From what I can tell, it was a group called the Brothers Wilcox who tried to bid on it, so it sounds like Jedediah did get some help from his brothers, Horace and Dennis. Tried to come together to purchase the house, but they had no luck. A man named William Bradley is the one who eventually came out on top, winning the bid. Some of you know him from Bradley and Hubbard Manufacturing. He also owned Bradley Park on the west side of town, the Bradley Trotting Park for horses. And curiously enough, when Jedediah Wilcox was the president of the Meriden Horse Association, Bradley was his vice president. So you've got this guy who you thought was your friend who comes in and steals your house from you after it's foreclosed. But the next day, the newspapers are abuzz because they say, quote, "It is now said that Charles Parker is the real purchaser of the Jed Wilcox Mansion." So the guy who's been his business competition, who's beaten him twice for mayor, is the one who's really purchased the house. And a lot of folks, at least in the years since the house was demolished, may have known it as the Charles Parker Mansion, which is where Parker lived for a good time while he was mayor. When Parker buys it, it was only for $44,000. That included the mortgage on what was still owned. So that's $150,000 less than what its original construction value was. At the same time, Jedediah owned this building here. To orient you, this is the Center Congregational Church. This is the Memorial Boulevard today. The tavern was over here, and Stop and Shop is right over here, the big landmark. Jedediah owned this building here. Any guesses as to who purchased that building?
Charles Parker.
Not Charles Parker.
Bradley?
Nope.
Brother.
Not his brother. The other historic figure I mentioned.
Platt.
Orville Platt, the divorce lawyer from his divorce, buys that building. So he's got a lot of, slaps in the face all throughout his life, just like we all do, I guess. So in 1874, he moved his family to New Haven, Connecticut, where he lived the rest of his life. Some really interesting articles that came up in newspapers after 1874 when he leaves Meriden. A rumor that he's going to become the president of another woolen mill. This one that he purchases a railroad with a man named Joel Sperry. And this, I think, is one of my favorite articles that I've ever come across. It's called Jedediah Wilcox Overcome by the Heat. And this is just a little article about how he gets off a train, passes out, and they take him to his house because of the heat. So even though he's in New Haven, he still has enough stature while he's there that it warrants an article in the newspaper. He died in 1897 on a trip to Kentucky. Every article I can find says it was a business trip. But if you take a look at the fact that he died in Louisville, and he was the president of the Meriden Horse Association, and it's at the same time as the Kentucky Derby in 1897, I have a feeling he was doing a little bit of side business while he was there. He died of apoplexy, which was bleeding as a result of a stroke. And from what we can tell, he was by himself in his room when he passed. The hotel no longer stands. There's a second generation of it, but there's no other information except one little log in the death books in Louisville, Kentucky that says Jedediah Wilcox, apoplexy. So part of what I've been trying to do is, also as a genealogist, is find out what I can about his family. And of course, the easiest thing that you can find about an ancestor is usually what? Their grave, right? They're died, they're buried, they're not moving. You can find it. But that's not true with Jedediah Wilcox. It makes everything challenging. There were no references to any burial, any special funeral except that which was in his house. And I came here one day, and I was really, really frustrated. I can't find anything. And I talked to Jan Franco in the back over here, and she says, well, if he died and his body was brought back to New Haven, which the obituaries say, he's probably buried in one of two places. Grove Street Cemetery. Many of you may have heard of that. That's the really big cemetery in New Haven. Or another cemetery, Evergreen, which was another big cemetery. So I pretty fast ruled out Cedar. That's Cedar. The one I just said. Grove Street, excuse me, sorry. Grove Street I ruled out. He wasn't listed in their online database. So I call Evergreen Cemetery. And I said, I'm looking for a man named Jedediah Wilcox. Is he buried there? And they came back and they said, oh, no, I'm sorry. And I said, could you double check? I'm really frustrated. It's taken me 6 months. I can't find the guy. And so they said, well, when did he die? And I said, 1897. Oh, that's our ancient records. So they pull the old books and they come back to the phone and they said, you said Wilcox? Yes. Jedediah? Yes. Well, he was here. Not what I was hoping to hear when I get off the phone with the cemetery. And they say he was exhumed in 1904. So 7 years after his burial. And I said, well, can you tell me anything? All it says is Berlin. Now, Berlin is where his son was buried. His first wife was buried, where his first wife's family was from. But I had walked stone by stone in the Wilcox Cemetery and every other cemetery, nothing. And I said, well, what more can you tell me? And they said nothing. And sadly, the New Haven City Hall wouldn't allow me to look at any burial documents. So I had really no idea. So I had gone to, this is where he was originally buried. This was the former Wilcox plot right there. Unearthed him and took him over to Berlin. And it was interesting. I had gone there one day with my friend Melissa, and I said, you're going to walk this cemetery with me, stone by stone, until we find Wilcox. And we were looking, and at one point we stopped, and we saw this stone behind us, and it was the Deming family plot. And I saw the name Henry Camp Deming, who was his father-in-law. I said, oh, hey, it's the in-laws over there. Made nothing of it. And very long story short, after doing some research at the Bradley home, where his daughter Lillian died, found a small reference in her files, which I don't even know why they kept it, that said, on my gravestone is to be Jedediah Wilcox, my father, Henrietta Deming, my mother. So by her death in the 1960s, there was no gravestone. And she just magically wrote that her cemetery was Maple Cemetery in Berlin. So this first stone that I had looked at and passed off is actually where he's buried. An unmarked grave, which really upsets me. But one day we will raise the money to put a grave there. And it's really, I go visit him every so often. And it's a beautiful cemetery, but he really, as I said, has been wiped from the scene of history. There's really nothing that's left for people to remember him by when it comes to that. So,
I'm sorry, so which cemetery is it on?
this is Maple Cemetery. If you're heading up, yep, in Berlin, it's off, if you're heading up the Berlin Turnpike, it's off a side road. It's up there. Unmarked grave. It's the first grave at the corner between their ancient burial ground and the current grave area. So just a brief recap of the years afterwards. The house was sold to Charles Parker. They moved in around 1874-75. $20,600 was the amount without the mortgage that they paid for it. It remained in the Parker family and descendants until the 50s, when it was sold to a woman named Josephine Fiala, who converted it into a nursing home. And then in 1867, she makes it known that she plans to close the nursing home, and she's going to sell it to Mobil Oil Corporation for the demolition and to construct a hotel and a gas station. And if any of you were around then, you will remember that this is also in the talks for 691 to come in. Were discussed, and 691 does cut right next to where the property was, but the house wasn't in the way of the highway. That same year, the Meriden Historical Society and the Meriden Arts and Crafts Association, which today is known as Gallery 53, started this campaign to save the mansion. And I am very grateful to them. They've given me these two boards, which are up here. This front one is a blown up of the house. And this is what I believe was a promotional board they put together when they were trying to save the house. You can see an article in the top left, which ran in the New England Yankee magazine, 90 Days to Live, on the decision of this house was going to be demolished. They were trying to raise money, the goal of $400,000, to make it a museum. They were going to bring in exhibits from the Smithsonian, from the Museum of Modern Art, from the Metropolitan, and really make it also a museum of Meriden history. What was interesting was, while they weren't getting exhibits from the Metropolitan Museum, we shipped a bunch of stuff up to the Metropolitan. And as many of you know, the Met came in just before demolition and rescued 3 rooms of furnishings from the house. This is some great photos that the Met has of the actual deconstruction. You can see them in the house taking out the pilasters, the columns, and then up in their studios in New York repairing the original furniture from the house, reupholstering it. Great care was taken into preserving this history. And then reconstructing the room in situ in New York City. Have any of you been to see the room in New York?
I saw one.
Did you?
Yes.
Oh, yes, they have 3 in their collection. I don't know if they still do. And only 1 was put up on exhibit. So they may have more. That I don't know yet. That's one of my next spots for research, is to go up there and see what their collections are. And this is the room there today. They've got a great sign right out front. They show you the picture of the house. They say it's from Meriden, Connecticut. I get really excited when I get up there. I know some of you have been there with me, so it's a really great experience to go up. And they've done an incredible recreation of it. I have 2 books open over there. One is on Victorian interiors, and one is the Period Rooms book for the Met. And you can see how they've really done a great job in this room to recreate the space. And so here you can see on the left is the parlor. It's called the Renaissance Revival Parlor, compared to the photos I showed earlier from the 60s. This is the door, the archway. They've reupholstered these 2 pieces of, these 2 chairs. And again, the comparison, the before on the right and the after on the left. What I find really interesting is that they put this room up in the 80s, and it was expected to be a really quick temporary exhibit. 20, 30 years later, it's still on display in their period room section. A website, and just a quick one, I found Prices for Antiques, still has sales that have been done online. So these are just some of the pieces from the house that have gone up for auction online within the past 3 or 4 years. Frank Lamphere, a local cartoonist who many of you may know, did a cartoon about Jedediah Wilcox in 1975 when the copper beaches, which the site was known for, was going to come down, Ebenezer Meriden against the ghost of Jedediah Wilcox, which I think he was always doing, coming back, how dare you take this down? But his legacy has been living on. The Mansfield Numismatic Society, which studies money, has some great copies of banknotes from this one is 1873, this one's 1862, and here you can see signed by Jedediah Wilcox. These were banknotes that were probably given to his employees to go to the bank and get their money out. I've been in talks with them because they find his money interesting in particular, because in 1873, this bill had been outlawed. You weren't allowed to distribute bills like that. Yet for some reason, J. Wilcox and Company and the Meriden National Bank were still printing bills of this size and of this denomination. At this point, banks were now nationalized, so there was a national currency. So while you shouldn't still be using local currency when you've got a national. And so many of you know today, 816 Broad Street, the Beaches complex. That's what's there now. 2 images of the woolen mill, which was the J. Wilcox headquarters. Today, 290 Pratt Street, which was later General Motors and New Departure. And today it's got a whole bunch of buildings in there. And I was given a tour of the building itself. And on the upper floor, if you have a chance to go peek around, the offices that are up there are all exposed to the rafters, so you can really get an idea of what these spaces originally looked like while they were factory buildings. You worked in there? It's a really great space. I don't want to keep you too long, but this is a story that I really enjoy. I had been doing some research one night, and I often will spend a couple hours a night searching J. Wilcox, Jedediah Wilcox, Wilcox Mansion, Wilcox Meriden, whatever combo of those I can come up with. And I came across a blog of a woman down in Danville, Virginia, and she was talking about this fence that she had just resurrected at her house in Virginia, and it came from the Wilcox Mansion. She had this whole blog post about the history of the Wilcox Mansion, her restoration of the fence. This is a Library of Congress photo here compared to what's reconstructed her house down in Danville. So it's a contemporary house, similar in architectural style, and you can see right out front proudly is this mansion. And so I got so excited. This was 2 in the morning. Again, nobody to tell, by myself. And so I decided, you know what, I'm going to be a little creepy. I'm going to go to Facebook and try to find this woman. So I find her page, and for those of you who are on Facebook, you can choose to send the person a message, even if you don't know them. So I'm sitting there, should I do this, should I not? So I click the message button, and up pops a window that she had messaged me 6 months before. I had not found it, but she had seen that I'd given a talk like this here at the library a couple of years ago and wanted to know what information I had. So I'm very proud to say that we've kept in touch. We've had phone calls. I've been to the house. She's remotely let me in and let my family and I tour through the house. She's got overmantels. She's got the fence. She's got carpet samples. She's got a couple things that have come from the Wilcox Mansion. If anyone's interested, she's currently selling the overmantel mirror. It's too big for the house.
How did she acquire that?
This house, her and her husband have actually been working on it for about 15 years, trying to restore painstakingly.
The fence.
Yep, and they've been working for 15 years, and about 10, 12 years ago, this fence came up on eBay. Oh. And she had plugged it in, decided not to buy it, and she went back, and it was gone. But she had messaged the seller earlier, so she re-messaged them back and said, okay, now I'm interested. They had taken the listing down. And so the fence was still here in Connecticut. It was actually with a descendant of the woman who last owned the Wilcox Mansion. And they were able to purchase that as well as some of the other furnishings from the house. She's a very friendly woman. I'll probably see her next week or the week after. She says to say hello to everybody. She's so proud of the fact that she's got this element of Meriden down there. It is. And if you have a chance when you get home, if you just Google the Danville Experience, you'll be able to see her blog, and it talks all about the restoration they did to this fence and what it really meant to them. She also told me about a home in Madison, Connecticut, which is where she bought this, of which a lot of the woodworkings from the house have been reconstructed. So if you have a chance to look at the photos on the table afterwards, you'll see this buffet side table from the dining room in the photo where it's falling into this triple arch with a large mirror and a side cabinet below. Another massive mirror here, which is the one she's currently selling.
Those are from the mansion?
Those are all from the mansion. And I love that you've got this, I don't know what the outside of the house looks like, but you've got this small, intimate family living room with this massive woodwork that just comes in right on top. And so there's a house in Madison that's also been preserving the history of this house. The Connecticut Historical Society also came in and purchased some of the furnishings from the house. When I contacted them to ask what they still had, I was about 2 years too late in that they had cleaned out their collection and they had sold them all off. So all they have currently is the newel post from the staircase and the guy who holds the torchliere on top. It's in one of their off-site storage units, so I'm hoping to go see it within the next few months. But unfortunately, Connecticut Historical no longer has it, which is why there's been a flood in the antique online world of these objects. Very excited to say Jedediah Wilcox made it into the Hall of Fame. Long overdue. The Meriden Hall of Fame was inducted this past October, so his memory will remain. And the next step of what my research is hopefully collecting oral histories. So those of you who remember the house, were around as kids when it was around, or you remember when it was demolished, I want to hear the stories. And I want to collect that, and maybe one day there'll be a book of memories or a book about the house, and including what this house really meant to this community. So these are just a few of the ones that I've gotten on Facebook, actually. There was one that I posted, does anybody remember this house? And 3 days later, and 150 comments later, there were people weighing in who were all from Meriden, who may be across the country, about what this house meant. One of the great ones was, most of all, I remember the ginkgo tree there with its unusual fan-shaped leaves. I'd bring them in for show and tell when I was a kid at Roger Sherman. People talking about the tunnel that used to be next to the mansion. There was a tunnel, yes, that ran alongside of it. This comment here by Anthony Neville in the back of the room. And then people saying how spooky it was, how scary and how creepy. And then one guy just saying, miss all the old mansions on Broad Street, now the beach's offices. So I have over on the table here a little takeaway card, which says, do you remember me at the top? So if you have memories of the house, I ask you to please send me an email. I'd love to talk to you at some point and really collect the history of the house. And so here's a little comparison, 1868 to 2010. This is a 2010 photo of the beach's property today, imposed behind it what the mansion would look like today if it still stood. And I want to close with a quote from Alan Church, who many of you know used to write for the Record Journal and was an editor there. And he said in an article in 2000, when they were removing some of the beach's trees from the house, it is worth noting that neighbors' civic interest in large trees is generally insufficient reason to hamper development. At the time, Planning Commission Chairman Roger DeZeno noted that, quote, by all rights, that property is his. He can cut down all the trees if he wants to. The same, I guess, applies to old mansions. It really is a shame, I believe, that we have permitted our culture to be so driven by the urge to make a buck that everything, trees, homes, even the mountains, must yield before that almighty imperative. So thank you.